Welcome back, Richard. It's
Good morning.
you this morning.
Good morning. Yeah, it's good to be here.
Good. It's good.
Um,
It's
you
good to
were,
see you. And we were going to have a podcast this week, which was another presentation that we did, similar to last week at Beacon Hill Fellowship. But we haven't received the copy of the video for that yet, so we weren't able to post it. So we're going to talk about something different today.
right. We have finished with May, which was Mental Health Awareness Month, and had some good things happen during May. And now we're into June, launching ourselves into June with a topic of interest. I
Yeah.
think to everybody.
And I think it's really timely because, as you said, we're into June now, and that is the summer months. And so parents, I don't know about you, Richard, but parents have been asking every day. I'm getting parents asking, what do I do about my kids' cell phone use and electronic use and stuff like that. And so I think it's very timely that we're going to spend a couple of podcasts talking about this.
Absolutely. I think with the end of school, I think most parents are concerned about they're concerned about it and they're asking questions about their children's screen time or digital or however you want to. I like I like the phrase screen time because it encompasses all the screens that they
Right.
might be spending their time on. Parents are concerned about, legitimately concerned about screen time during the summer months,
Yeah.
especially with young children. With older children, they get involved in activities and jobs and sports. But with younger children in particular, it's a challenge, particularly young teenagers. And we're going to talk about that.
Absolutely. And a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the new book. We covered an article that talked about a new book by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation. And he in that book, he talks a lot about what he sees as a major issue, a major problem that
Right.
in many ways he says is caused by cell phones and screen time, as you said. And
Just the mere title of the book, he says we have this anxious generation, which it's in the news, everybody's talking about it. But he said how the subtitle is how the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness. And of course, the idea there is that screens are somehow causing the rapid increase in mental illness, especially among teenagers, and most especially among young teenagers. Again, young teenagers are middle schoolers, and we've had this problem developmental phase of middle school, and it seems to be most exacerbated in those young teenagers. But to make that statement, when you start talking about causality, I know you and I both become very cautious when people talk about something is causing something else.
yeah, the word cause is a very, very powerful word, especially in research. It is a sometimes seen as a dangerous word in
Yeah.
research. But when it comes to even sort of the practical discussion about the relationship between screen time and mental health and just our overall well-being, I think that the use of cause, the word cause, is you have to be very careful with it. And so, so we're going to talk a little bit about that because over the last few weeks, several articles have been written, sort of challenging the notion of
Right.
causality, that the notion that screen time causes anything, mental
Right.
illness, problems with sleep, even, whatever the case may be. But there's some articles coming out that's really pushing that a little bit.
That's right. And Haidt's book, Haidt is a social psychologist. That means he talks about issues that might explain our behavior. And so, on the one hand, he did a good thing in publishing this book because it has resulted in a very vibrant, a lively discussion about screen time, especially among teenagers. At the same time, though, to say that screen time is causing the epidemic, it makes good headlines because parents are concerned about this. They talk about my daughter is addicted to her phone. You know, they talk about it as an addiction. My kids are spending too much time in their bedrooms playing video games. So we know that there's a concern, but to say that screen time is causing is not good science. It's very
Right.
difficult to say that in our field, in psychology, that something is causing something else. May be related, but it may not be a causal relationship. It's not good science. But the practical problem is that if parents read something like this, I mean, they pick up this book and they said, oh, here it is, here's the explanation,
Right.
could frighten parents into making some bad parenting decisions. And that's the only issue here is that while I don't, but we have to be careful with this idea that something is causing something else, because what I fear is that parents are going to read this book and they're going to make some bad parenting decisions
Right.
based on this single idea. Okay.
Absolutely. And just as a quick note, when you're talking about causality in research, it requires a level of control in a research study that, to be honest, is rarely managed.
We,
It is extremely difficult. And Richard, we've both worked in research and we've both tried to control conditions well enough to where you could find a causal link between two things. And it is extremely difficult because that means you're ruling out all of these other potential causes. And so, when we talked about Haight's book and that hypothesis a couple of weeks ago, we kind of voiced a little bit of concern about this idea of cause. And
right.
so, when you're working with rats or pigeons, like Skinner did, or like a lot of other experimental psychologists have, that's one thing because you can control all those conditions. But when you're talking about kids who live in the real world, parents who live in the real world, where there's all these other influences, I think it's really difficult to even enter into the realm of causality.
That's
Uh,
right. Mhm.
yeah.
That's right. Yeah, one of the most famous psychologists of all time in our country was B.F. Skinner.
Mhm.
But B.F. Skinner used little animals. He used rats and pigeons, and he controlled everything about those animals. I mean, he made them motivated. How did he increase motivation? He starved them for a while, and they were very hungry. They would do anything to eat, including what he wanted for his experiment. You can't do that with children. You
Right.
can't starve them and say, "Okay, now we're not going to feed you until you learn the times tables."
Yeah.
But so we can't control all the variables. So to discuss causality is a very complicated issue. Okay. Um, so if you so while we don't disagree with Haidt, while we appreciate his insights, a more reasonable approach is and we would recommend this article by Aaron Weiner in Psychology Today. It's called "Why Are Screens Bad for Teens?" And he talks about the many reasons why they are bad. He acknowledges that smartphones can be bad for teens, but there are limits on what we
Right.
can do about it. I mean,
Right.
here we, once you give them the bottle, they're going to let the genie out. I mean, parents say, "Well, my kids have to have a cell phone." Well, once you hand them a smartphone, the
Right.
the genie's going to come out of the bottle, and you're not going to be able to get it back in.
And I know that you've experienced the same thing. It's not just for the child, for the teenager that the genie's out. It is for the parent as well, because every parent, not every parent, many parents have, Life 360 on their phone. And so
Mhm.
they know where their kid is. They know, they can keep track of, depending on what level of the app you have with your kid, you can tell how fast they're accelerating in the car when they're driving. And so it gives parents a level of supervision of their kid when the child isn't immediately in their environment
Right,
that most parents do not want to give up. You
right, right.
A parent is not going to go from being able to look at her phone, his or her phone, and know exactly where their kid is to say,
Mhm.
you know what, I'm going to give that up and I'm not going to know anything about what's going on.
I know people who track 13 or 14 or 15, all their friends, all their relatives, they track everybody. And I'm thinking, how do you have time to do that?
Right.
Well, I want to know where everybody is. My son took my phone from me the other day, said, Dad, give me your phone. And he did something to it. And now I can check out at the grocery store just by putting my phone. Now you're going to laugh when I say this, Bernie, because you probably been doing this for 20 years.
Okay.
Um, I can put my phone next to the checkout, and I have that magic. I don't even know what it's called, but I have it on my phone now. Thanks. Don't shake your head like that.
Right.
I now have this thing on my phone. It is so wonderful to have that. These devices are I mean, they really are wonderful devices.
Yeah.
They do so much, and they're so useful in so many ways. And that's why we don't like to call this an addiction.
Right.
Okay. An addiction, when we talk about addiction, we're talking about something that's always bad. Vaping is never good for teenagers. No matter how you slice that, vaping is never good. Marijuana use in teenagers is never a good thing. It doesn't matter how. So, because it's always bad, there's a zero tolerance. We don't have zero tolerance with these devices.
Right.
And
Yep.
so
Can do.
they fall into a different categories. They're kind of a necessary evil right now. Okay. And
Right.
so we have to learn how to manage them.
Absolutely. And, a lot of research has talked about, social media as being especially concerning. And again, it's not necessarily something that we disagree with. When you're looking at research, like the recent Gallup survey that said that teenagers spend about 5 hours a day on social media,
Right.
that's a concern. When you think about things like video game use, and there was some recent research that says that about 10%, 1 in 10 teenagers have what they refer to as pathological video gaming behavior,
Right.
and that this worsens over time. Now, that sounds horrible and that sounds scary, but again, let's recognize that 90%, 9 out of 10 don't. They don't have those things. That means that they play those same games, but
Right.
they don't have the pathological video gaming behavior. So
That's right.
while it
Right.
poses a problem for some people, of course, it doesn't mean that it's a problem for everybody. And again, that's what takes us back to the word cause, because if it causes it for one person, it should cause it for everyone.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, because whether you talk about social media, on average, 5 hours a day, that means some kids are spending more and some kids are spending less. So you can't say every teen, you're saying on average,
Right.
it's 5 hours. 1 in 10, that means 9 out of 10 don't do that. All right. Whether we're talking about drug use, cell phone use, it doesn't matter. As a matter of fact, we have the 80-20 rule. You
Right.
and I have talked about that many times,
Right.
that there's an 80% chance that it's not a mental illness. Only 20% of the population has a mental illness. So despite the numerous dangers, challenges, pitfalls, the answer isn't to bar kids from using this technology. If you want to take it from, the only way you could do that is you'd have to take everything, shut off the internet, and not let your kids ever go in public, because as soon as they walk out the door, they're going to have access to devices, not theirs, but their friends. Okay.
Right.
So you'd have to lock them in an isolated room. So the challenge here is to teach them how to use it. At some point in this, we're going to talk about, think of it as a tool. You don't give a kid an electric drill when he's 4 or 5 or 6 years old and say, here, have fun. Okay. So
Yeah.
harm can be done when we give these very powerful devices with no boundaries, with no directions, with no guidelines, without close supervision. And I think that's how we have to start thinking about this, is not that it's bad or it's addictive, but rather these are powerful tools, but we have to help youngsters, especially preteens and young teenagers, how to use them responsibly.
Absolutely. And while we include a link to that article from Weiner in the show notes, there was another article that they came out recently from the Wall Street Journal that, my goodness, this one had both of us sort of pausing. And I remember when I first sent it to you and said something about it, he goes, she's wrong.
That's my first
And
response, right?
but it's fascinating as you start breaking it down. because this researcher, she makes some very important and good points when you
Right,
start to really look at the research that we've been talking about for years. And we admit that we were there too, because when you're reading the research, it sounds valid and it fits with some of the things that we see clinically. And so it makes sense that these things go together. But this is Shelby Harris, and she's a clinical psychologist, and she says that it's becoming more evident that technology in and of itself isn't always the problem.
right.
Sometimes it is, but it's not always the problem.
Correct. Right. This one was mainly about rethinking our the conventional wisdom. We've been talking about blue light and dopamine release and all these things that we've been talking about over the years, and everybody's familiar with those things. But these articles made me stop and pause and say, well, wait a minute, let's rethink this thing. Let's take a new approach, because tech isn't the problem. In and of itself is not the problem. All right. There are other variables here. This article talks mainly about sleep, and we all worry about the effect of this on children. But in fact, for some of us, watching a movie, especially, I mean, you can't watch an action adventure film and then go to sleep, but there are things that you can watch that would help you go to sleep despite the effects of blue light. I've written and talked about the effects of blue light, but if you look at the research that has been done is saying it may not be the problem that we once thought it was. I mean, we've done research with different brightness on the screens, and it doesn't seem to matter. In fact, it probably only changes the time that it takes to fall asleep by 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, that when you measure it carefully, we're only talking about a few minutes difference. Now, we are advised to turn them off before we go to sleep, and this article gives 6 very useful recommendations that anybody can use to improve sleep hygiene. But it may not be the boogeyman that we have made it out to be. Okay.
Absolutely. There's a third article that we'll have a link to from the Atlantic, and
Oh,
and this one is entitled "The Panic Over Smartphones Doesn't Help Teens. It Only Makes Things Worse." And when you read that, that goes right back to something you said a few minutes ago, that you know talking about this causal link between
right,
technology and mental health problems sounds good on the surface, but it does lead to other problems. And that problem is that mainly that what are we going to do about it? I mean, we can't take phones away, and it just creates more and more conflicts and problems between the parents and the
right.
children.
That's
They're
right.
conflict or arguments.
I really like this article. The woman who wrote it is an associate dean for research and a professor at UC Irvine. So this is a woman who has spent her over 20 years, she and her colleagues, doing research on these very topics. Okay,
Right.
so this is very carefully constructed research projects. And the most striking sentence was, my colleagues and I have repeatedly failed to find compelling support for the claim that digital technology use is a major contributor to depression and other mental health symptoms. So despite all the research they're doing, they're not finding this causal link. They're not even finding a strong association.
Right. Yeah, they've done some analyses of the analyses, some analyses of the studies that have been done,
Mhm.
and they found that there really is a very weak relationship between technology and mental health conditions, mental illness, sleep problems, and all of those things. And again, it kind of goes against what we have traditionally thought and what we have talked about for
Right,
years now.
right.
And so it really shakes your foundation a little bit as you're thinking about it, but we need to keep talking about it. We need to keep thinking about this a little bit.
That's right. And um, when you and I have talked about all these things. We've talked about the effects of blue light. We've talked about the addiction issue, and are they really addicted, and the dangers inherent in technology. So that's why when we talk about Haidt's book, I think he did while we question this causality issue, it has really given everybody who's working in this field, everybody who's working with parents and children, it's given us pause to say, wait a minute, let's review the research more carefully, and let's look at all these issues. Let's look at sleep. Let's look at addiction. Let's look at time spent on screen and whether it really is related to mental illness. So I think we have sleep and mental illness and addiction are the three sort of major topics that percolate out of this discussion. Because there was a review done about a year ago from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And they did a study of studies, and they said, I mean, their conclusion was available research that links social media to health shows small effects and weak associations. So what that means is, to us at least, it means that there's something else at work here. There are other factors at work that we need to be aware of, and that we need to slow this thing down a little bit, and be a little more thoughtful about how we approach this. And these articles do begin to raise issues about what factor, if it's not digital use, if it's not screen time, what other factors do matter?
And I think that that's a really important part of all of this, because, if the research is saying that, well, the relationship may not be as strong as we thought, and usually what that means is that that whatever it is, whether we're talking about technology, or we're talking about, eating red meat, or we're talking about, whatever, that it affects some people more than it affects other people.
Right.
That's usually what that type of thing means. And so we can probably conclude the same thing, that smartphones and all of these devices and screens are going to affect some at a disproportionately higher level, or in more ways than it's going to affect others. And those factors, there's reasons for that, is that there are other factors. One of those other factors is a family history of mental illness. If there's a family history, or if the child, him or herself, has a history of mental illness, the likelihood is that screens are going to have a different effect and influence on them than it would a person who doesn't have a family history or personal history of mental illness.
That's right. And that's the first thing I think that parents need to think about. Anybody who has children knows that they're, even within the same family, children are different, right? And so if you think about the personalities of your children, what we know is this: cell phones are not universally bad for everybody. Smartphones are not universally bad for every teenager. They are a problem for some teenagers. Okay, it's like drug use. We talk about drug use, and most kids don't get addicted. Look, most children don't get addicted. Marijuana is a gateway drug only for a very small number of children, a very small percentage of children. And we've been over and over and over this. Marijuana use is only a problem, and it becomes a problem for a very small percentage of kids who use it. Most kids try it and say no. Some kids use it socially. Some kids might use it to help them sleep, but most people don't go on to harder drugs. It's the same with this technology. Most children are not going to have a problem with it. Berney, how many times have you said children all over the world play violent video games?
Right. Well,
most don't become violent.
We've been saying this since the late 90s, when Columbine happened, right? And the first reports came out, and they were blaming, Dune, that these kids, Dylan and Eric, played on their computer, and they blamed violent video games. And again, and listening to Marilyn Manson, and metal music, and the lore to blame those things is very attractive and very easy, because we want someone to blame. We want an explanation why, for reasons why seemingly normal, healthy kids would do something so so crazy, so unexpected. So we want something to blame. But when you step back and you look at it rationally, you could say, millions of people play those games.
Right.
Millions of people play those games and don't have any problems with violence or aggression or anything like that. So well, we can't make those connections just because it's convenient and easy. There is this relationship with a history or personal or family history of mental illness. There is a relationship with, people who've had ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, when people have experienced trauma in their life, people who have excess stress from school or from families or from their communities. We know that those kinds of conditions seem to make at least some people especially susceptible to ill effects. But they're going to, my perspective is that they're going to have a more dramatic and maybe potentially more negative response to anything, whether it's video games or it's their cell phone use and social media or TV shows or magazines that they're reading. They're going to be much more attracted to magazines about, guns and violence than they are going to be about magazines related to, movie stars.
Right. Yeah. So I think that what we're trying to, the point we're making here is that while it's intuitively appealing to say that smartphones or digital technology or screen time is universally bad, is universally addictive, it really isn't. It is for some. And so what we have to figure out, the challenge for all of us is, how is this particular individual going to be affected by screen time, and how are they going to use screen time? All right. But I think I think we're I almost said unfortunate truth, but the truth is that this is going to be an individual consideration, and it's going to vary from child to child. If you think about your own children, I have 4 children, and if I handed each of my 4 children a smartphone, each of them would use it differently based on their personality. Some of my kids, some of my children would have no problem at all, and I would never have to worry about it. But others, I would have to be a little more concerned because of their personality and temperament.
Right.
And I think that's how we have to approach this. So that the factors that matter are, we talk about a history of mental illness. If you have anxiety in your family, okay, if you have depression running through your family or bipolar disorder, maybe you should be a little more careful, or ADHD. We have ADHD in my family. It runs deep, and most of us are affected by it. So my relationship with digital technology is probably going to be a little bit different than yours because you don't have ADHD in your family. Also, this exposure to adverse circumstances. You take a kid who's been damaged, traumatized, his relationship with screens is going to be very different. Right. So I think we have to stop thinking about these things as being universally bad or addictive, because they really aren't in any traditional sense. And they're not bad for everybody. They're bad for some.
Right.
Okay.
And we'll include another link. There's research that suggests that smartphones can actually boost teenagers' mood. And this is some work out of University of Wisconsin-Madison. And so it's not, we have to be careful that we don't grab onto this causal link and start making broad statements, broad decisions that are going to affect everyone, when really, maybe we need to sort of whittle down and figure out a little bit more detail about how it affects people and in what circumstances it affects people more or less than others.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. This one really, I was stunned when I saw this one, because it's done by some pretty good, I mean, these are pretty careful researchers at the University of Wisconsin. And they found in the sample that they studied, and it was a couple hundred kids, that smartphones might actually have a positive effect on kids' mood. It can have a positive effect. And once again, we see these individual differences, that for some children, it's a negative effect, but for many, it could have a positive effect. So I think we have to stop thinking of these things as being bad. Think of them as a tool. The other point we should make is that the time when parents gift their children these smartphones is at preteen or young teenage years. But keep in mind that it's the young teenagers who are having the biggest struggle with these devices.
Right.
So there is a correlation um, between when we hand these very powerful tools over to our children, and we hand them to them at the most vulnerable time of their lives, which is the early teenage years. That may be a larger factor than anything else. That's the struggle. It's those middle school kids who are having the biggest challenges. And before we leave that topic, they're underrepresented in all the studies. Most of the studies that are done on college students.
Right.
And college students are vastly different than new teenagers. So it may be the age effect that we should be looking at too.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's a lot more to consider than just how much cell phone use they have and how much time they spend on social media. So now in the next podcast, we're going to talk about some specific recommendations, guidelines that have been proposed by some folks, as well as the approach that we're taking here in our office when we're working with kids and families.
Right.
Because again, I think many times we begin a battle that we have no way to win. And so we need to make better decisions about how we're approaching these things. So that will be in the next podcast. All right. So that until then, stay happy, stay healthy, and forget to be afraid.